My name's Susie Scott. I work as a manager within GCVS, and my role this morning is simply to do the welcome to this latest in our series of Our World Reimagined sessions. This morning we're joined by Janet Whitley from the Scottish Government, and also from Mary Glasgow from Children First, who will be responding from the third sector at the end of the session. But the main person holding this all together and taking over from me for the rest of the session will be Pennie Taylor, who will be doing the general introductions, keeping the show on the road, and making sure that we all keep to time. So I will hand over to Pennie now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be involved in this third of the Our World Reimagined Big Ideas series. And just a little bit of introduction to me. I'm a health journalist, a health and social care journalist in Scotland. And everything we've been talking about in this series has been absolutely vital discussion to be having around Scotland. So thank you very much for inviting me to be involved. Now, I'm just to run through a little bit of housekeeping. We have on Zoom, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see there are some icons. If you want to ask a question, please click the Q&A box, and that allows you to put a question to the speaker. Either you can put the question while you're listening or afterwards. It allows you to pose your question anonymously if you wish. And if a question's already been asked that you'd like to also ask, click like, and it's called upvoting or something like that. And it pushes it up a list. The chat function, which you'll also see an icon for, use that to post any links you might want to post, to communicate with other delegates listening into this. It's for you to populate that. So thank you very much. Now, normally we would have had a moment to touch base and for me to ask you, Janet Whitley or Whitley? Which one is it?
It's Whitley, like Whitley B.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Now, Janet, you're going to be talking about collective leadership. You're head of the Scottish Government's collective leadership team. And I'm just going to say welcome, really welcome. And it'll be great to hear what you have to say, your big idea.
Okay, so thank you so much, Pennie. And like you, it's lovely to be involved in this session this morning. And I guess really just to start off and recognising that we've only got a certain amount of time to go through this. The idea that I want to offer this morning is that there might be a different kind of leadership that would serve us for our communities for the future. And so it's probably no surprise, given the title for the session and the team that I work with, that what I'm thinking about is collective leadership. And it seems clear to me that in terms of working and leading in the complexity and in the uncertainty that we're all now facing, there's different sorts of leadership that we need, and that the leadership that we have doesn't always serve us well for these sorts of circumstances. And also, I think, particularly in these times of uncertainty, opportunities to connect and support each other in our leadership seem more important than ever before in terms of the sorts of practices that we adopt. And so in terms of thinking about the complex issues that we're working on, and then the particular situation that we find ourselves in, it's really clear to me that the issues that we face can't be resolved by any one individual, any one organisation, or any one sector working on their own. We need to find ways to work collectively, and for that to help us to navigate the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So to try and just capture this idea in a way that's hopefully simple and easy to understand, I've broken it down into 5 components of collective leadership, and what I see as the 5 most important components of collective leadership. So the first one of those is around understanding complexity and recognising that when we work in complex living systems, as we do, that there's an unpredictability about our actions, and that whilst, you know, in many ways we're familiar with project plans and organisational charts that might suggest that there's a logical and rational way through things, actually, when we're working in complexity, we often don't know what the impact of what we do is going to be, and that the organisational diagram might more resemble a plate of spaghetti than a series of boxes, and we have to find ways to work with that. And so that tells us, gives us a clue that it might be different ways that we need to find. And so I suppose also thinking about different styles of leadership for working in complexity. I mean, one of the reference points that we use in our work is Peter Senge, who has taught us a lot about systems leadership, and who, I suppose, recognises that there's different kinds of leadership that might be deployed in different sorts of circumstances. But certainly, when we're thinking about complex systems and systems leadership, there's a need for us to think about the kind of different kinds of leadership. So personal leadership might serve us well in some circumstances, and we bring our own self, our own personality, whereas system leadership really enables, I guess I can say a little bit of what Peter Senge says, that organisational self-interest becomes recontextualised as people discover their own organisational success depends on creating well-being within the larger system. So it's thinking about that larger system focus. So that's that kind of sense of complex systems. Now the second point is about practices that support self-reflection and recognising that to function well in these complex systems, we need to find ways to show up and be present in that system and able to collectively lead with other people a greater level of depth perhaps than we're familiar with. And a quote around here is from our work with Margaret Whitley. And Margaret talks about to navigate life today, we definitely need new maps. Our old ones confuse us unendingly. These new maps are waiting for us. They'll appear as soon as we quiet down and with other lost companions, relax into the unfamiliarity of this new place, senses open, curious rather than afraid. So that kind of sense, and again, recognising the rapid pace of all of the work that goes on around us, and I guess particularly in these times, understanding that to create some stillness, to find a way and some practices that might help us to create some stillness, allow us to understand ourselves better and be more present in a leadership context in the sorts of conversations that we might have. And examples might include mindfulness practice or guided journaling or something like that. So that's point number 2. Moving on to number 3 is curiosity and inquiring stance. And so I suppose finding a way in thinking about complex issues in our leadership to let go of any preconceived ideas about what the outcome might be, and to embrace a leadership setting with genuine curiosity and inquiry together about what possible solutions might be. Now, this can be very difficult and very counterintuitive in terms of recognising that, you know, very often we have to establish project plans or you know, ways that try to suggest that we can predict the future and predict how our interventions in complex systems might have an impact. As opposed to work collectively with a team around a complex issue, to have a genuine openness and a curiosity about what might be possible is quite fundamental. So letting go of any preconceived ideas, and also, I guess, recognising that how we interact with one another in leadership settings might often conventionally place a lot of importance on having the answer or knowing the solution, and how we deliver that can also, I guess, really flavour how a leadership conversation can go. So the work of Chris Agiris can help us there, and he talks about advocacy and making a point directly as if you really know the answer. And in collective leadership, where we're really trying to inquire together, what we need to deploy is not so much advocacy, I know, it's about asking questions and inquiring together. So really practicing that method of inquiring rather than insisting on knowing, and bringing that curiosity into the setting. The fourth point is about collective leadership being fundamentally relational and using methods that really illustrate that the relational dynamics, the human relations, are fundamentally important in terms of how we think about collective leadership. And one of the main areas I'd want to emphasize here is listening. And it might seem glib to talk about the importance of listening to one another, but actually the quality of how we listen and the characteristics that we bring to that listening are quite fundamental in terms of what the possibilities are to come up with a collective outcome together. And I'm sure we're probably all familiar with circumstances where we might be listening to some extent, but I guess our mind's already moving on to the next point, or we're thinking, oh, what's a really clever question I can ask? Or, we're not fully listening to the person that we're engaging with. And so understanding that there's different levels of listening and there's different qualities of listening, and that actually we need to get to a way of generative listening and actually really having the possibility for our mind to be changed by what we hear is fundamental in terms of how we think about collective leadership. So practicing listening and using approaches that enable us to really practice that deeper level of listening are fundamental as well. And then I guess also within that relational aspect is a commitment to think about diverse views. So coming around any kind of complex issue that we're working on, an ability to draw in different perspectives and find ways to hear those different perspectives in different sorts of ways. And the fifth and final area in terms of collective leadership that I would want to highlight is a sense of comfort with emergence. So kind of getting to a point of realizing that not knowing is actually important in this work. So if we're to collectively lead around an issue, it's really, really important to trust the process, to trust that the collective practice can surface a solution and a kind of leadership approach that's going to allow us to make progress on the issues. And so none of us can be holding a kind of solution. We've got to trust that emergence can take place. And again, that's very counterintuitive in the kind of leadership practice that we're familiar with. And so I guess finding ways to know in different ways and to really hold that space are really important. And a little quote from Meg Wheatley on this: life changes through emergence, not incrementally. Instead of the simple sum of individual parts, life mixes it all up, networks of relationships, and produces something new. So I guess that kind of sense of finding a way to be comfortable and feels important. So I hope the 5 components that I've mentioned help to bring to life a little bit what I mean by collective leadership. And brought together, I think it's the interplay of those that can really allow collective leadership to emerge around a complex issue. And so in a sense, there's my idea.
Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I'm going to encourage the participants in this. Please get your questions in on the Q&A. Use the Q&A function on your screen. While we wait for some of those to come in, I wonder if I can ask you, Janet, you work within Scottish Government. Now, Scottish Government can sometimes feel quite remote from people working in the community across Scotland. How is your work landing in there? Is it making a difference?
I think that's a really important question, Penny. So thank you for asking it. Our work on collective leadership, our team is based within Scottish Government. but actually much of our work is happening out with Scottish Government, working with teams on real live complex issues all around Scotland, and actually sometimes in Wales and Northern Ireland and different places too. So it's actually very outward facing work, but we have been working in Scottish Government, so in a sense it's not to completely duck your question. There has been a lot of interest and engagement. I think it's also about recognising where the places are where there's an appetite to draw the different voices and a different approach around collective leadership. And we found that there really are some areas and some work within Scottish Government where there has been that interest. I wouldn't, at all signal that it's the approach for every piece of work. It just isn't. It's about, finding where this approach can be deployed and where there's an opportunity for that to happen.
Okay, and presumably it also helps an organisation to identify perhaps an area of real blockage where under current leadership it's not going to happen. Does it get used that way?
Yes, I think so. I mean, quite often people come to us. I mean, I guess the way our team works is to offer support where colleagues are working on their issue, as well as offering a lot of programmes and development opportunities. But very often, I guess people know they want to make a difference. I guess we probably all come to work like that, wanting to do something that's going to help, but just having no idea actually about what to do. And so some of the practices might feel quite unfamiliar or might feel, frankly, a bit weird. But actually, if you get to a point where you think, I simply don't know what to do around this, then that can be a really rich opportunity to actually try something very different.
Thank you very much. Now we've got some questions that have come in. Jenny Robinson has asked, she'd appreciate a case study. She'd like to sort of hear about lived examples as she describes them. Now we have a limited amount of time here, so perhaps something that's in greater detail can be picked up later. I'll come back to that. But can you sort of encapsulate very briefly, for example, how it's been used, collective leadership?
Yeah. And I guess an example that springs to mind immediately is a piece of work that our team's been supporting around sectarianism in Scotland. So I suppose illustrative of a really embedded, entrenched kind of issue, and where the work's been used to bring together a different set of voices around that issue in a different sort of way. So recognising that actually how we facilitate conversation can make a huge difference. So our intervention on collective leadership would invite in different people, policy leads, people leading the different factions, I suppose, in sectarianism, different parts of communities, different ways of seeing things, and work collectively through a process where a more inquiring conversation, different sorts of questions can be explored and create opportunities to hear different voices in different sorts of ways, such that the group can move on from perhaps having strongly held pre-existing views. And so opening up the questions, opening up the issues, and allowing different sorts of conversations to take place. And what I would say for people who are interested in more information, we do have a storybook on our website, so people can click straight in and we can send that round, as well as being totally up for conversations that people want to have. That's a way to read a bit more, because I realise I've had to be very, very brief just now.
Thank you very much. A question has come in basically also asking, how is this, to your knowledge, is collective leadership being applied in the third sector in Scotland in any meaningful way that you know of?
Yeah, and I would say collective leadership for us is, and our work is around issues and the people that are working around those issues. And so in any locality or around any theme, the third sector partners are very often a really critical part of that. So I would say, because we focus not sector by sector or organisation by organisation, our work is very often maybe place-based around, thinking about the issues around a particular locality, in which case the third sector organisations will have a key role amongst other partners around that. And so I would say yes, but I mean, it's a bit like my answer about Scottish Government. In a sense, it's not absolutely blanket, and many people are very familiar with using some of the practices and the approach to leadership that I've described. But in our particular interpretation and combination, I would say yes, there are areas where we're working with third sector partners, definitely.
Another question, specifically asking, it's Beatrice Vegas who's asking this, and Beatrice is asking, how can collective leadership help folk with disabilities? What might it mean?
Okay. I suspect collective leadership can help, in a sense, with any issue where there might be colleagues that are feeling that they're maybe not being heard, or their voices aren't influencing in the way that they possibly could. So a piece of work around, I guess if there was a specific set of issues where the person that's asked the question, sorry, I've forgotten the name there, Beatrice. Yeah, if there's a particular set of issues where it's really, really important to bring those perspectives in, I guess in any issue it's important, then I guess using practices which are more open in terms of collective leadership to really genuinely draw in different perspectives and use lived experience much more widely, then I can see that there's lots of different ways to think about that kind of application.
And an interesting challenge back to participants perhaps is, if you felt that collective leadership would benefit in any setting, how would you go about suggesting it, driving it forward, for instance? But let's get some reflections on that. Let me ask you another question that's come in, Janet, which is, what kind of advice would you give to new charity leaders at the moment? So there's leaders being used in, actually, before we ask that question, how do we define leader in this context?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question, Penny, and also whoever might have asked that one. So I think we've got all sorts of frames of how we think about leaders. Certainly for my work and the work in collective leadership, I'm seeing leadership existing across all levels of our wider system. It's not about positional leaders. It's not about only those that hold the most senior roles. It's recognising we've all got a leadership role to play in our society. And so that would be my first point. But then also in terms of collective leadership, I think it's much less about our personal role as a leader, and much more about the collective leadership that emerges around a complex issue. So it's kind of both of those things.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think, I hope Yagana Ramsey thinks you've answered her question. I think I heard an answer in there, because she's saying, what kind of advice would you give to a new charity leader? I mean, in a nutshell, what would you say? If you had a slogan.
Okay. Well, I think being put on the spot like that, for me, it's always about listening and being open to other perspectives. And I guess that can stand us in enormously good stead in terms of how we deploy our leadership and how we begin the first steps of thinking about collective leadership.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, are new job specifications required to sort of embed these qualities in a role, for instance? And I'm hearing what you're saying about we're all leaders, but actually there are also heads of organizations that have that formal role. Are we talking about recruiting differently here?
I think that's a really interesting question, Penny, and also just playing back to your earlier question about Scottish Government. I'm just remembering there was a session that our team hosted for quite a large grouping of colleagues in Scottish Government, and somebody did stand up at the end and say, oh, we should have this in our induction sessions. So I think sometimes thinking about actually, maybe there are ways to begin to develop just a greater valuing of the characteristics of collective leadership in our wider systems.
Thanks. We've got an attendee from New Zealand, Howard Youngs. Welcome, Howard Youngs, who I don't know what time of day or night it is in New Zealand. Maybe somebody can tell me. The question is, what types of trigger events and intentional actions can assist a group transition to a place of comfort with emergence. So, you know, is a pandemic perhaps one of those?
Yeah, yeah. You know, I guess that's a really interesting question, because I think for me, having comfort with emergence, you know, it is quite a difficult process, but I think that shared experience, and for me, it's also the interplay between the different components. So a group that's taken the time, you know, to do some deeper reflection together, that's taken the time, you know, perhaps to hear some wider perspectives, perhaps in different sorts of ways. So the other thing to signal, I guess, in terms of thinking about how we work with groups, you know, sitting around a boardroom table might not be the optimum almost ever, but certainly when we're thinking about collective leadership. So a shared experience of listening together to different perspectives, hearing voices in different sorts of ways, taking the time to allow that to digest, and perhaps using different practices in terms of, you know, different ways of knowing. I think these sorts of elements can support that comfort with emergence. I think for all of us, there's always something about recognizing, you know, what's possible, and witnessing some of the shifts that can happen and seeing how that plays out in communities. So I think the other thing I would always say is that within a group, there's always different aspects of where people are. So, you know, I think there's probably different points at which members of a group would be feeling different sorts of things, and kind of recognizing that one's experience can then play into how others are feeling too.
If I may ask a quick question, does it require formal training? Is there formal training? I mean, can you shift old mindsets into new collective leadership mindsets quite quickly?
I think, yeah, well, I think there's again many answers to that question, Penny. Thank you. We do offer development, and we do offer training. We offer a leadership and facilitation program, which in more normal times is a residential program, which is offered over a week, and then we offer other sorts of interventions. For us, what's actually really, really important is facilitation. So recognizing that many of us as leaders in this wider system might be trying to deploy some of this, you know, some of these practices, some of these methods, but actually the temptation and sometimes the push into the ways that we're very familiar with is incredibly strong. And so I guess we might think, oh, well, I'll try and do this. You know, the push to do the old ways is really strong. So having facilitation support, skilled facilitation in this kind of work can be transformational in terms of what's possible within a group. And so I guess the group's learning in real time, in practice, about collective leadership. We offer other interventions, but you know, I guess the method of learning in the work is also another dimension that's really important to us.
Thank you. And I think that answers Ruth Bradley's question, which has been upvoted, if I'm using the right word. The next question comes from Paul White. Do you think the economic downturn, with everything that's going to come with it, is an opportunity or a threat to collective leadership? Do you think people will use that as an excuse not to do it now, or embrace it?
Interesting. And I think there'll always be those that feel drawn to collective leadership, and the time will be right for some of them. I think the thing about the present time is you know, it's so such deep unknowing prevailing right across, right globally. So, you know, if there was ever a moment where people might think, well, you know, the old things we've been doing are not working, you know, this might be it. And so it could be that with all of the economic pressures, the societal, you know, the social pressures, all of these things, it could be that for some people they're thinking, well, actually, that's it, I'm ready to try something new. But for others, it could feel just, you know, so exhausting, or you know, that it really isn't. And so I would say there'd be a whole blend of responses. But I think it's for me the opportunity to think, you know, in these times about, well, what is it we're looking for that we've learned from all of our COVID experience, that to deploy some collective leadership approaches in thinking about what might be possible, that seems like a really great opportunity.
Yeah, well, let me answer, because Maggie has asked, has referenced a new Everyone Home collective in Scotland that formed at the start of lockdown. 30 leaders across the third and academic sectors focused on the issue of homelessness at systems level. What type of support is available for collective leadership structures that are emerging as a result of the pandemic? Because there must be a fragile moment where it could dissipate. What advice would you give briefly? Sorry to...
Yeah, we've lots
You're being very brief anyway, so thank you.
We've lots of resources available on our website, and myself and other colleagues from the team are always open, for people to have a conversation with us if there's any way that we can help. But certainly, I guess we're always prepared to offer our time. There's sessions and programs that we're offering. In fact, we've got a program on collective leadership for renewal, which is all online, all free of charge, which has been offered over the next couple of months. So it might well be that there's things in there that look as if they're helpful, emerging and just looking for some support in terms of what they're doing.
Thank you. Now, Nikki Imrie has asked, can you suggest any practical methods to help make the case for relational leadership and move beyond siloed working practices where this is not our area can be the answer too often?
Yeah. And I think, in a sense, there's a whole array of different illustrations of why siloed working wouldn't be the answer. I mean, for me, what I think often makes the argument best and what makes the difference is an experience. So I think, sometimes quite a short experience can be where people suddenly have a kind of aha moment about, well, actually, the other ways of working, the siloed working, is simply not getting us there. And so I think something as simple as, rather than having the meetings in the way that we're used to go for a dialogue walk maybe with a colleague and have the conversation in a different sort of way and practice listening in a different sort of way, and just really change that dynamic. So sometimes I think it's kind of step by step, experience by experience, that we start to shift. I guess where people have maybe felt entrenched in a particular model.
There are people that have built whole careers on a political model, a particular model, for instance. And Cynthia asks a question that concludes, how do we move big egos in leadership to a collective model? What would you say if you sit in front of a big ego who might be resisting this? What would be your approach, your sell?
I know. Well, I think the stories of the difference that can be made are the most compelling evidence. So I guess where people have told us, the sorts of testimonials that we've had of actually this has transformed how we were trying to address this issue. I think our system is awash with colleagues who believe that they have the answers, and with egos, and that's just part of our wider system. That's part of the world we're in. And so I think illustrating and by personal experience, I think there's often been colleagues who maybe come into a meeting a bit cynical or a bit unconvinced, and by experiencing what can be different with this kind of practice, can leave that meeting thinking, well, actually, I might give that a try.
Okay, now an anonymous attendee has commented, this is too vague. If that anonymous attendee wants to kind of come back and say what you'd like more specificity on, I'll take it up for you. But I mean, I think we're hearing a new concept here. And, do people want kind of tick box guidelines, do it this way, it works? Do you find that being one of the hurdles that maybe has to be overcome, Janet?
Yeah, I think there's just lots of kind of new public management models and methods that are very, very embedded in how we do our work. And I guess many of us, we're trained and have worked with these sorts of methods and expectations. And there's demands placed on us to deliver projects and deadlines, and we're very, very familiar with all of that. I guess my question is has that worked? How's that working out? And in terms of the outcomes for society, and therefore, is it worth giving a chance to something that enables a more emergent kind of approach?
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you, is what evidence have we got that collective leadership works? You know, is there any proof that this is a productive path to go down, or might it be another kind of like weed diversion?
Yeah, and I think we do have evidence. I think we've got quite a lot of gathering case studies and materials and testimonials and just experience of where we can see that colleagues or communities or groups have very genuinely reached a different sort of outcome because they've practiced leadership collectively in a different kind of way, and they've got to a place, they've got to a different sort of endpoint that they would acknowledge they would never have got to had they not been thinking a bit different about their leadership.
Thank you very much. And those stories, for instance, can be found on your website, and those links will be made to delegates. Let me ask you a question that's come in from Neil Lovelock, who's saying that Catherine Trebeck, another speaker in this series, who we'll be hearing from in a couple of sessions' time, she talks about the 2 SCs, survive and cope, and systems change. Many third sector organisations are full on delivering and adapting to deliver services and support to help people survive and cope. So how do we create the safe spaces and time for collective leadership on system change with diverse input when we're firefighting?
Yeah, no, I totally get it, and I think that's the tension in terms of the pace, and I think particularly emphasised during the whole COVID response, and the absolute necessity for certain aspects to be really, really fast. But what I would say is sometimes some quite small practices or interventions or different ways of doing things can be enough, to make a little bit of a difference. So it's not always possible, to take time, to convene groups in different sorts of ways, and to really engage with deep integrity with communities or with families or whatever it is. That's not always possible. And I suppose it's just recognising that there's a time where we absolutely have to deliver, and then there's other times where there is a developmental space. But I would say even in that rapid delivery, sometimes maybe taking 15 minutes to do a different sort of check-in at the start of a meeting to see perspectives differently, or to begin step by step to be trying different practices, even in this rapid delivery phase, can start to illustrate the kinds of differences that can be made.
And are there forums that you know of where, for instance, people can share their experience of trying to introduce this where they are?
Yeah, I mean, through our work on collective leadership, we've got a network of colleagues who've all been involved in different sorts of ways with our programmes, and I guess we stay in touch and offer events and activities. So that would be our kind of network. And colleagues are always welcome to become part of that and to become more closely involved with our work. And there might well be other places and other ways to get involved, but certainly that would be one that is definitely open for colleagues if they would like to be with peers. And I think the other thing just to mention is this can be quite isolating work, leading change and trying to kind of develop a different approach in an environment that can sometimes feel a bit hostile in terms of those sorts of changes. So having a strong peer community can be exceptionally important, in terms of, just building up that sense of, well, we've tried this, or, this happened, and or even, oh my goodness, this works. And that's so that peer community is very, very important.
So perhaps a challenge back to delegates who are intrigued and want to take this further in this context. Let me put the last question to you from Beatrice Vegas. It can cause confusion, says Beatrice, listening to so many voices. Does it stop us moving forward and cause stalemate if one can't agree on something? So in other words, yeah, you can start these conversations, but how do you finish them?
Yeah. Beatrice, thank you. That is a really helpful point. And I think sometimes it's not about finding consensus. It's about really finding ways to listen to difference and recognizing, that actually, if we can be open to the different perspectives coming in, it can enable us to actually, it's not about holding a view and then, you know, trying to take them all in a kind of competitive environment. It's about being open to shift. And sometimes what might emerge would have been nobody's view. In a sense, it's a completely new thing, because we're genuinely getting to the point of being able to collectively generate something which is entirely different from, you know, any of the one views that anybody came in with.
Thank you so much. So much to think about there. We may have a few minutes to pick up at the end and answer any sort of outstanding issues, but I'd really like to introduce, if I may, to give us a response from the third sector to what Janet Whitley's been saying. Please say hi to Mary Glasgow, who's Chief Executive of Children First. Hi, Mary. Would you unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Not at the moment. You're muted again now, Mary. That's you. Yes.
Sorry, I did all my best work in that 30 seconds. It's lovely to be with you all. Thank you, Janet. I found that absolutely fascinating and really interesting from the perspective of somebody who is trying to lead in the way that you've described, although not necessarily maybe called it collective leadership. Is it okay to say a few words about what Children First do and who we are? Is that all right?
Go for it.
Just for colleagues on the call that don't know us. So Children First is Scotland's national children's charity. We're an organisation that works to protect children's rights to live safely within their own families and their own communities. So we support communities and families to build strengths and to keep children safe. And we also have historically had a huge focus on recovery from trauma. So particularly at times like this, where we know that Scotland's children and families and communities have been massively impacted by the pandemic, we've been offering direct support to keep children safe, making sure that families have emotional and practical support, but also really having an eye to what is it going to take to help children who've been most adversely affected to recover from this in the long term. So that's who we are and what we do. We've been around for 135 years, formerly known as the RSSPCC, and then changed our name to something a bit more positive about 40 years ago, and it's an absolute privilege to lead this organisation. It's also a real privilege to be with you for such an interesting conversation, and I was really struck listening to you, Janet, about how hopeful it felt, how hopeful it is to hear a colleague from Scottish Government talk about leadership in such a radical way, to talk about silos needing to be broken down, to talk about, I guess we might not have called it collective leadership in the third sector, but so much of what you said resonated for me, and I'm sure so much of it will have resonated for colleagues from the third sector on the call. To me, what you described is human-centred leadership, relationship-based approaches to the way that we design services, manage ourselves, organise change, make a contribution. And the things that I was struck for, and I know there's been some questions listed in the chat about, so how do you practically apply this? And it really struck me, I was kind of, as I was listening to you, it struck me that some of the things that we've tried to do at Children First might give some practical ideas about what that feels and looks like. The thing that struck me the most about what you've said is that the question that was asked about, well, how's that working out for us? The old-fashioned managerial approach, technocratic approach to leadership, almost, that was established in a very ordered world, where we knew who was in control, we knew where power lied, we knew the destination of where we wanted to get to, and the drivers of our society would be things like economic growth, for example, making sure that the system worked in the way that it always had, and that we were almost just keeping it ticking over, and we needed strong leaders with what I would refer to as a fairly command and control approach to leadership, so that everyone felt safe. And everybody knew that we're all going to be all right, because somebody in the big office at the back of the building would make all the decisions, tell us what to do, we'd all get on with it and it would all be fine. So I'm kind of like exaggerating to make the point, but I think what you're describing is an absolute shift away from that type of leadership to one which says, one, we're all leaders, and two, the world that we live in is much more complex than we ever thought before. And that we need to get used to that in a way that gives us some safe uncertainty that the world is becoming ever more complex. And those were just some of the kind of initial reflections and responses that I had to the comments that you made. I mean, I'm happy to go on if it's helpful to describe maybe how we've applied some of that thinking in our organisation.
Do you know what? I think we have the time. We started 7 minutes later, so we have got a few minutes spare to give us a full hour. Mary, if you'd like to talk about, because I think I've heard a call for give us some examples.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things that Janet described to me, or what I heard from that, was one, the importance of connection. And in Children First, we have a wee phrase where we always talk about connect before content. And we've basically taken an approach which is saying we're all, these false divisions that we put in place between those of us who deliver support to communities or families and those of us who receive support, those are fairly false divisions. And what we've created are some silos, not only in the way that the system operates, but also in the relationships between those who are perceived to be the helpers and those who get help. And one of the things that we've really had evidence of our approach working has been through the pandemic, when everybody's to a different degree had similar experiences of uncertainty and of fear. We've had to adapt to some of the ways that we've responded to families. We've had to be much more flexible. We've had to get much closer. We've had to work over Zoom on a Saturday night with families that we ordinarily before might have seen at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, because that was the way our organisation was structured. And what we've learned is that when you offer an insight into your living room on a Saturday night, at the same time as you're seeing somebody's real life on a Saturday night, the level and depth of that relationship gets much better, and the outcomes for the person that you're helping, when they feel they've got a contribution to make to you, when they get an opportunity to say, well, how's your Saturday night been, or how's your family coping with this? That's what relationships mean, when it's not just about being a passive recipient of support, but rather an active participant in a relationship that helps you figure out what it is that you need to change about your life.
Thank you, Mary. I think that's really useful insight. Janet, in response to that response, we've got a few minutes to play with, and I think it would be really good to ask. There's one question here that hasn't been addressed as such yet. Neil Lovelock asks, with regard to new maps, is there also a need for a new vision and or destination? Is there not a risk that our new maps may lead us exactly back to where we were, and how do we avoid that?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, because I think if we look over history and leadership styles and leadership approaches, we do see that, we see it's cyclical, and we see that actually some of the really entrenched, big, complex issues that we're facing now have been with us for a very, very long time, and people have been working extraordinarily hard to try and resolve them. So, in a sense, I understand a reticence to kind of sense that actually, does this really offer us something? And my response would be, it's worth a try, because actually it does embrace some different sorts of approaches in terms of, I suppose, also looking at ourselves and our own behaviour, and that's the bit that can be really difficult. So if we still come in thinking about Pennie's illustration of the big ego, if we still come in with that, actually we're going to keep doing that. The same outcomes are going to keep happening. Are we prepared to put that to one side as leaders? are we prepared to actually recognise we might not know, we might not have the answers, and these are the early steps that enable us to get into the possibility of something quite different happening. So I guess that would be my kind of reaction. But also thank you to Mary, because I think what you said was really helpful and clear, that when you talk about human-centred leadership, a lot of the things are the same that we're talking about. So in talking about collective leadership, I absolutely recognise that there's aspects and dimensions that you know, thankfully are present and prevalent in some parts of our leaders and also in our wider system. But it's that kind of possibility to bring all of that together and to practice more widely, I think offers us the best opportunity.
Thank you. Mary, I wonder if because I'm going to take the time. How challenging was it for you as a leader in your field to challenge yourself? If that was, I mean, I'm making an assumption based on how it would be for me. Forgive me if I'm wrong. You know, how difficult is that for an individual?
I think it's difficult. I think once you step in and take some courage. I think that question of, well, how's this working out? When I stepped into this organisation, I recognised that people felt, I mean, as the chief executive, I spent a lot of my time checking everybody else's work. And I just began to get really curious about that. Why does everything land up with me for a decision? And I realised actually it would be totally liberating, not only for me, but for the organisation and my colleagues, if we could just trust each other a bit more. You know, so I would begin to model a coaching style of leadership, if you like. So when colleagues would come to me and say, could you just check this before, or could you just sign off this press release, or could you just make sure that you're happy with this project outline? And I actually just began to take some personal risks where I would say, do you know what, I think you're really capable, really good at what you do, and I'm going to trust you that your intention is always to put children first and the organisation's best interests first. So I'm going to leave it with you on the basis that if it doesn't go well, I'll take responsibility alongside you, but let's just take some risks here. And just modelling that type of approach to leadership where you go, you are paid, you are trusted, you are a leader, and I'm going to let you get on with a job that I think you're more than capable to do, has built a culture in our organisation of people saying, I have autonomy, I have mastery, I have a contribution to make, and I'm trusted and valued when I step up, show some courage, take some risks, maybe make some mistakes, but when they come back into the leadership group and say, so that one never worked out so well, but here's what I learned and here's what we'll do next time. What we've developed at Children First is a culture of what Janet referred to as collective leadership, but what I call all-in leadership. So there is no division between what people are like as proper humans in their real life and how they operate in their work. So we talk about values-led leadership. And just one thing I did want to share, because I think a really practical example that might help illustrate Janet's point is the check-in, check-out at every single meeting. So at Children First, right across the organisation now, and I have to confess, when I first introduced this to the organisation 6 years ago, people would be like, you know, who is this weirdo that's trying to set up some strange cult? But we quickly got to the point where I say with confidence, every single meeting at Children First, from the board right the way through to the sessions that we do with community groups and families, start with check-ins. Now we use what we call the kit bag, developed by International Futures Forum, which is a toolkit that just creates a space for really connecting, sharing and listening. So this morning, just before I joined you, I was with my 4 colleagues from our executive team, and we checked out the meeting by using the feelings card from the kit bag. So quickly, in order to say, how do you feel at the end of this meeting? And let me tell you, it was a fairly challenging one. We had, you know, our accountant colleague, who's the director of finances, where this would not have been his comfort zone, actually saying, I feel after this meeting I've been challenged, highly supported, and the colour I feel is yellow. We had our Director of Strategic Planning saying, I'm green for go after this meeting. I'm clear about my purpose, I'm clear about the requests of me, and I cannot wait to get on with my day and deliver that. So using these really clear practices to say, let's connect with each other as humans before we get into the business of the work, helps establish, I think, what you've described, Janet, as a culture of collective leadership, which is human-centred and based on relationships. And all I can say is for our organisation, that's just a tiny example, but we've moved from being about growth to being about quality relationships and making a sustainable difference to our families.
Thank you. I'd very much like to give the last word to Janet Whitley there then. There's lived examples, let's put it that way, of change happening. Do you, and if I could ask you to answer it very briefly, do you really think this can be pulled off now in Scotland?
Yes. Yes, but I think I would just go back to, well, I think it's lovely to hear Mary's examples, and again I would absolutely recognise that you know, there's practices that are becoming more prevalent. I mean, check in and check out, I think, are fantastic practices and can completely change how we have a meeting. You know, so it would be something that we would always you know, try and use as well. And so I guess recognising that there's practices that are stepping towards collective leadership. And I think just to go back to that sense of the time that we're in now, if ever there was a time where there's, you know, a sense of, my goodness, there's something we need to do differently for future generations, can we try a different way? Then I think this is it. And so I would be clear that collective leadership offers us something for now.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant point to end on. I'd like to refer everybody to GCVS Mighty Networks, which is a network that can be used for sharing exactly this sort of information and a lot more. If you have a look on the chat feed, you'll see it there. I'm just going to close this fantastic discussion by reminding delegates that if you've enjoyed this, the recording will be available to you. You'll be sent a link. Please share it if you want to share these ideas. And if you like the Twitter action, it's hashtag OWR Big Ideas. Next, our next session is Participatory Democracy with Dr. Oliver Escobar, picking up exactly these themes and taking them even further. Please join us on the 23rd of September at 3:30 for that. Thank you so much. I'm gonna call it to an end now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.